Okay, so this is continuing our discussion of complex societies, the origins of civilization. And this is what we were meant to look at on Wednesday, yesterday's class. So just so we don't get too far behind, this is a kind of a video of the lecture, which you can stop at certain points if you miss something, right? And but I do expect everyone to watch it. Obviously, if you hear this now, you are. So we were looking at bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. Well, what would allow us to figure out if we were excavating at a site and it was a chiefdom, right? We talked a little bit about this before, but different sizes of sites, larger and smaller, some sort of information that shows that power is inherited, evidence of difference in wealth, symbols of power like prestige goods, right? These would all be kind of signs of complex societies. Right? Okay, so there's a big question that lots of archaeologists have looked at, and that is, how did civilizations evolve in different areas of the world? What led, let's say, chiefdoms to become states in Egypt and Mesopotamia and China? And so early on, people were looking at kind of the big reason. What was the reason, one reason, to explain civilization? So a guy by the name of Karl Wittfogel came up with a theory that he called the hydraulic theory. And basically what he thought is that, and obviously this is hydraulic, so it relates to water, right? But, you had the Egyptian civilization on the Nile, Mesopotamia on the Tigris and the Euphrates, Chinese civilization on the Yellow and Yangtze River, etc., etc. If you're going to live on a river and then start getting larger, eventually you're going to have to build some sort of irrigation. This is the logic behind the theory, right? Now, in order to have a large-scale irrigation project, you got to organize a lot of workers. So you can't just have lots of people to build it. You also need organization in order to tell the workers what to do, for them to be fed, etc., etc. You have to have a plan. Also, you can't just build irrigation canals and leave them, because then they're going to deteriorate over time. So you have to maintain them too, building and maintaining. So Wittfogel's idea was that societies at a certain point would reach a certain level where they needed irrigation. To have large-scale irrigation, they required lots of coordination and management and organization, and that essentially is the state, right? That kind of leadership, bureaucracy, management is a state society, a state level of organization, right? So essentially it's kind of a one factor leads to the other, right? The need for irrigation created the need for the state, thus the state was born in many areas around the world. So this was a good idea. It allowed archaeologists to go out and test this hypothesis. Turns out when they tested it in many different areas, it didn't really work out this way. Mesopotamia, for example, as we'll talk about, large-scale irrigation, the kind of irrigation that would require the organization of the state, only appeared much later, after the state was already there. Right? So rather than having irrigation quickly followed by the state, it was the state first and then irrigation much later. Right? So other people tried to come up with other ideas to explain the state. So another good idea was proposed by a guy named Carneiro. He had a very complicated title for it: population growth in a circumscribed environment. And this is circumscribed, not circumcised. Circumscribed means that it's bounded, it's limited, right? So he was looking at societies that were either bounded by mountains or by desert, where they couldn't grow past a certain point. There wasn't enough agricultural land past a certain point. So he said that when the population gets larger, but the agricultural system can't expand, there's going to be competition for resources, because more people, same amount of food. So he believed that, well, the natural outcome of this is going to be warfare. Right? We know that's not necessarily so, but this is his idea. There's going to be warfare. In order to have a successful military campaign, you need to be organized in the beginning, and then once you conquer another area, you're going to have people who are conquered, right? So they're going to be more of the lower class people. The people who did the conquering might be more of the upper class people. In order to organize all of this, you're creating more bureaucracy, management, organization, and that is the state. So essentially, to make it very simple, Carneiro believed that warfare led to the rise of the state, right? But specifically population leading to competition for resources, leading to warfare, created the state, right? But warfare was kind of the key here. So obviously a lot of assumptions. He believed that populations just get bigger and bigger and bigger. People can't limit their populations. We know that's not true. He also thought that warfare is a natural outcome of a competition for resources. That's not necessarily true either. Right? Okay, so those were two theories. Let's look at a couple more. One is long-distance trade. This is a theory that's been proposed for places like Mesopotamia that we'll talk about. Right? That is, we're not talking about trading from one village to the next. We're trading over long distances. So if you wanted to trade for something that you needed, first off, you have to produce something, right? So that requires some organization. Also, you have to organize, let's say, a long expedition to a faraway place in order to trade for that material and bring it back. So the idea was that in order to do this, right, let's say you needed a resource, it would then require you to improve your organization, for the organization to be greater, which would lead to the state. Okay, let's look at just two more theories that have been proposed to explain the state. Well, you're looking at ideology right now. You're reading that article and answering a brief question or a couple of questions about ideology, right? A belief system, worldview. This relates a little bit to Marxist perspectives, right? And Marxist perspectives essentially mean that you are looking at the economy in terms of how it influences the rest of society. Right? So according to the Marxist perspective, there's competition between different groups of people. Maybe they're like classes within the society. And at a certain point, let's say one class might gain more wealth and power than another. In order to make that permanent, right, in order to make that fixed, the people who have the greater amount of wealth and power create the state. And part of that is creating an ideology that supports them. Right? So essentially, the use of ideology by elites to perpetuate the differences that already exist in the society, to make those differences permanent and fixed. That's what a Marxist would say. Now, there's many drawbacks to this theory. One, it's very hard to test archaeologically. It's hard to figure out if an ideology is being invented. You can, as you saw in the reading, you can look at if elites or leaders are using ideology, right? But that's only one part of the equation, right? And as the reading says, an ideology that doesn't give, the common people anything is not something that they're going to believe. Marxists would say, look at the Pharaoh of ancient Egypt. The Pharaoh was considered to be a god. Right? That's a very convenient ideology for the Pharaoh, right? Supports the idea that he should be in charge, and it reduces insurrection, rebellion, and things like that. So Marxists would say, obviously, the ruling class invented that ideology to support themselves. And Timothy Earle, who you're reading, would say, well, there has to be something positive for people as well, right? Maybe a sense of natural order to things, or they wouldn't accept that kind of ideology, right? So Marxist perspectives on the origins of civilization are kind of hard to test. a sort of a theory from the 70s proposed by these two guys from the University of Michigan, Flannery and Wright. It's called systems theory, and essentially what they mean is that, well, maybe we can't nail it down to one thing. Maybe it's not population growth or trade or warfare or class conflict, or the need for irrigation. Maybe it's a combination of many different things. And maybe these ancient civilizations worked like a system. And the inputs lead to sort of outputs. And this is kind of a pretty good idea. And you can see kind of the different theories again. So this one at the bottom is like a systems theory, right? Where you might have different kinds of factors that would be important. In some societies, one factor might be more important than another. And as an archaeologist, you kind of just have to figure out, okay, which of these is the most important, or which combination of factors kind of push the state forward in this society. And that's what we're going to see when we talk about these different civilizations. There are most likely different reasons for why each of them went from tribes to chiefdoms and then to states. Right? Okay. Well, as you're kind of reading about these complex societies, right, we're really kind of getting a little bit almost into political science. And we're also getting into some of social science that talks about needs, right? People's needs. And so in many societies throughout history, there was sort of a belief that whereas people were obligated to give tribute and food and labor to a ruler, the ruler was obligated to help them if there was a crisis, and to make sure that the people were well off. Right? When you talk about the needs of a society, there's more than just biological needs. Right? That is, yes, we need food, we need shelter, we need maybe medical care. Today our basic needs are maybe a little bit more complicated because of technology, right? We need internet, we need things like that. But for society to function, you need more than just that. What do you need? You need some sort of ideology, right? Some sort of system of beliefs that holds people together. Right? Otherwise, they're going to fragment apart. So an example of this would be Afghanistan, where some people would say that people's loyalty and identity is more closely tied to their ethnic group than to their nationality of Afghani, right? And so you really have kind of different communities sort of pulling apart rather than pulling together to form one Afghanistan. Right? You also need social order. Without social order, things break down. This is what when these things start to deteriorate is when you start to have collapse. And this is some of the things that you'll be investigating when you start looking at collapse. Right? But if you have a large scale society with lots of people and organization, there's a lot of potential in terms of what that society can do. Lots of labor, surplus food to feed workers, right? To promote specialists, to work on technology, things like that. You could only have a specialist. And this is something that Jared Diamond talked about in the film Guns, Germs, and Steel. You could only have specialists in societies where agriculture is being produced and where you have surplus, right? So it's during these times that we get people who experiment with pottery and metals and other things. They start producing crafts, right? So it becomes very important. But you could see in some of these Egyptian depictions, ancient Egyptian depictions, storage shows how important some of these storage facilities were. They're essentially like the bank of the nation, right? Also, you need integration, right? As we're going to see, you need to have an organization to the society. Okay. We talked about the different forms of power, right? Military, economic. These are very, very important forms of power for ancient rulers. And there's also ideology, because ideology and religion's a part of ideology, is a belief system, a worldview that could be used to support the power of the leaders, right? So this is a medieval manuscript showing, you could see, an archbishop crowning a king, right? And this, connects to the medieval belief in Europe of the divine right of kings, that kings ruled based on the will of God, essentially. They were anointed by God. They were chosen, selected by God. And so there was a real taboo, even among people who were trying to depose a king, other royals were trying to depose a king and take over, of killing the previous king, because the previous king was anointed by God, right? So this was part of the belief system that you could say supported the power of kings, right? But as you saw in the reading, ideology is not a fail-safe form of power. Okay, bureaucracy, right? We don't like it, we say. Well, actually we do when it works, right? So we don't like bad bureaucracy or inefficient bureaucracy, but we need bureaucracy, right? Without bureaucracy, we could not function. You need organization in every society, right? So if there was no IRS, there would be no ability to check who was paying taxes and who wasn't. There wouldn't be careful records of this, and so it would be very hard to plan budgets ahead of time. So we need that. We need, let's say, a registrar in the university to keep track of who's registered for what, right? We need bureaucracy. But if you have bureaucracy and you have a large labor force, right, then again, many things are possible. This is showing the building of the interstate in the United States in the 1950s, right? So this was a large-scale government program, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which benefited the country in many important ways, had to be done at a nation level, couldn't be done just state by state, but shows a certain level of organization and complexity. Right? Okay, we're going to see that through time, leaders manipulate ideology. They use different techniques to maybe strengthen their grip on power or increase their own power. Right? And some of this, as you saw in the reading, involves monuments. Monuments are a way of taking elements of the ideology and making them material, making them into something physical, right? So this is a statue of the founder of the Republic of Modern Turkey. His name was Mustafa Kemal, or Ataturk. Right? He founded the Turkish Republic in the 1920s. His statue and his picture are everywhere, right? So just the presence of Ataturk everywhere is kind of a form of using the ideology, right? Some leaders try to manipulate the ideology, right? And will do things that are actually factually incorrect, right? So here's Joseph Stalin with Lenin behind him, right? And from this poster, Lenin was the previous leader, Stalin was the leader in the 1930s of the Soviet Union. From this picture, you would get the idea that Lenin approved very highly of Stalin, and that Stalin was the natural successor to Lenin. And the truth is that Lenin disliked and distrusted Stalin, and even warned people about Stalin on his deathbed, right? But what he's doing is he's reworking the history, just, changing the facts, and using it for propaganda. Is propaganda effective? Well, that's hard to tell. Right? So there are different forms of ideology, different forms of belief systems. Right? This is a cool little board game that I saw called Ideology, where political ideologies are represented by different characters. Right? So here's Stalin representing communism, Ayatollah Khomeini representing theocratism. This is Kaiser Wilhelm II representing nationalism, I guess, or totalitarianism. This is Teddy Roosevelt representing, Western democracy, and also Winston Churchill maybe representing conservatism, Western democracy as well. So there's different political ideologies that we know today. These things, the important thing to keep in mind is these things frame how you view the world. If you adhere to one worldview or another, you're going to view things differently. And this was absolutely true with ancient people as well, we think. Right? As a Marxist, let's say, analyzing classes in different societies, might look at like the caste system in India, where people are relegated to strict classes based on birth, right? And their caste can determine what occupation they have and who they can marry, right? Adhering to the social rules in your lifetime can reward you in a reincarnation, your reincarnated life, with being born into a higher caste. So a Marxist might say, well, this kind of ideology supports the status quo because it means that if you don't rebel against the system but kind of play along with the system, that you will benefit in the end, right? So that's kind of another example of how, let's say, a Marxist might look at ideology or class system. There's also an idea called cultural hegemony, right? And this hegemony means the domination of ideas or beliefs over one group. And sometimes we see that in ancient societies, but we also see what we could call agency and resistance, right? People making up their own minds or resisting the sort of top-down approach of beliefs, right? Okay, well, next week we are going to look at ancient writing, and we're going to get to do a little bit of ancient writing, because writing appeared in many of these ancient states. As we'll see, not all, but appeared in many of these ancient states. We're going to look at how writing appeared in different states and the reasons for the development of writing.